to different Afrofuturists. I feel like it has such a personal definition, and
Right.
I was wondering how you would define it.
What I think that I think that the views of Africans and African culture, oftentimes, I think it's almost like as a direct result of colonization, but oftentimes it's very limited in terms of time. You know, like it's looked at, it's explored only in certain chunks of time. You know what I mean? Like and I think that because the continent of Africa and humanity on that continent is so old, you know, that's like a horrible disservice to the people that come from those cultures. So I think that Afrofuturism is kind of a response to that. You know, it finds a way to connect history of African cultures, you know, with an expanded future. You know, with a future that goes beyond, you know, anything that you know, it goes beyond the present day. But it finds a way to bridge the cultural aspects, you know, of the ancient African traditions, you know, with the potential, you know what I mean, of the future, and just looking at Africans and African culture in that context is like, you know, it's refreshing, you know, when you're used to looking at it in the context that you know, mainstream media tends to portray it in.
Tell me something. What do you know about Wakanda? It's a third world country. Textiles, shepherds, cool outfits, all a front. Explorers have searched for it. Called it El Dorado. They looked for it in South America. But it was in Africa the whole time. I'm the only one who's seen it and made it out alive. I can see you. The world is changing. Soon there will only be the conquered and the conquerors.
Step into the spotlight.
You are a good man.
Step into the spotlight.
With a good heart. And it's hard for a good man to be a king.
From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network, this is a special presentation for African History Month. The episode is titled The Black Panther, the movie. Spectacular movie that has broken all box office records for the particular genre. We'll start out with Variety, which is a show business paper. This is dated on the 16th of February. Black Panther scores a record 5.2 million on the Thursday opening. Opened with a bang, picked up a muscular. This is a Variety speaking here. 25.2 million in Thursday's previous showings. The comic book adaptation is making history. Is the first Marvel Cinematic Universal movie to feature a black or African protagonist. It's breaking potentially strong reviews, and the Marvel mystique are all proving to be potent combinations of Black Panther. Is projected to debut at over 170 million over President's Weekend, and it did in fact do that. Has already set records. The fourth biggest pre-seller in Pentagon history. The Thursday opening numbers represent a new high mark for the month of February. They are roughly double the previous record of 12.7 million, which was set by Deadpool. It also ranks as the second biggest picture for Marvel Comics behind the Avengers. Age of Ultron, which was at 27.6 million for its preview. The film did particularly well in IMAX screenings, picking up 3 million for those locations. And the overseas, as they call it, also drew overseas, which it grossed 47 million since being rolled out on Tuesday. It's now showing in several major markets. Groups include the UK, Hong Kong, Taiwan, France, Australia, and on Friday, Black Panther opens in Spain, Mexico, Finland, India, and South Africa. Now, what is very important here, you have an African cast that is projected or streamed to the African diaspora. A very important situation. We'll talk more about in the second here how this came about. The characters here in the movie, and of course, always it's this kingdom of Wakanda. It's called, and this was Stan Lee. It came off of his pen in 1966. It had a budget of $200 million, as well as tens of millions in promotional spending. It starred Chadwick Boseman as a titular character, as well as Michael B. Jordan, Lupus Nyong'o, and Ryan Coogler is the director of it, and he was also did Creed and Fruitvale. Says behind the camera, he is the first African director of a Marvel comic picture. I remember the Marvel comics in the 60s as a kid. These heroes coming out, and in 1966 or so, we actually saw the Black Panther, and I thought it was amazing. Although it was not as accessible, it was part of the Fantastic Four, not as accessible and not as promoted up as other items were out there. Now, the Black Panther rules with 23.2 million overseas. This is also from Variety. Opens in 17 locations, and some we didn't name. In South Korea, France. Domestically, they will launch. It's already launched, so it's a little behind on this. It opened to 2.7 million in the UK, 4.7 million in South Korea, 2 million in Taiwan, and 1.6 million in France, and 1.1 million in Hong Kong. Black Panther is outpacing previous comic book hits such as Doctor Strange, Wonder Woman, and Guardians of the Galaxy, all of which august for a healthy opening weekend and much to celebrate in the halls of Marvel. Black Panther, of course, directed it. They reiterate this. We won't get into much of that, but it continues to roll out around the world this weekend. Will include close to 70% of the international marketplace by Sunday. That has already happened. In addition, in North America, it will open in Germany, Australia, Brazil, Austria, Croatia, surprise there, Czech Republic, Denmark, Greece, Hungary, Israel, and several other territories. So it is a truly an international film, no doubt about that. And this is more coverage from a Variety as we move around here. This is the 18th film from the Marvel Studios. And let's see, this was trying to do a little date. This is on the 6th of February, 2018. Most of these are in early February. The film is 2 hours and 14 minutes. And not to repeat ourselves here, but before we get carried away, let's be clear, the Black Panther is still a superhero movie, which means effectively conceived for 10-year-olds, of those who wish a movie like this had existed when they were 10 years old. Well, it did exist when we were 10 years old. Anyway, except the latter category is potentially bigger than ever this time around for the Marvel movie, since there's never been in the history of cinema a film that allows an ensemble of African American characters to take charge of a global scale, take charge on a global scale, excuse me. And you may want their entire lives to witness just such a feat, the way that Wonder Woman had a hugely empowered game changer for women. Wonder Woman, of course, is a series on a national TV. When national TV counted more, when Wonder Woman was on the air, as we would say in these days. But this movie is well done. Professor Reed out of Oakland, California, who had a birthday this week, I wish him a happy birthday. It talked about African American writers on the scene. Well, first of all, African American writers, and we get to Taushi Coates in a minute here. He is one of the writers for the Marvel comic book that was released in a big comic book fan. We have to confess, we've never been big comic book fans. Had a cousin that had Superman and those sorts of comics from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and I don't know what happened to his collection. But anyway, nonetheless, he had those, and there were some educational comics. I almost found the series, but we sort of passed it by. Nonetheless, opening in a mythical kingdom of Wakanda, the Black Panther effectively anticipated DJ Trump's alleged comments about asshole countries whose refugees prefer the U.S. way to their huts. Without disparaging the rest of Africa, this is Ryan Kruger. He is the director, and his crew suggest what the continent might have become had it never been stripped of its resources. This is very important, and from a developmental standpoint, that the colonial rule in Africa did in fact strip the resources of the continent, period, in many countries within the continent. Some in America assume that Africa is just a country. It's not a country. It's a very large continent with millions of people that inhabit it, and language groups, etc. And this whole development paradigm, as we get more of these movies out, we'll look at it. But many of the countries were left with colonial structures. Although when the countries reached their emancipation, many of them took the socialist path, and that's something that is not enunciated properly. If we look at Zimbabwe, for instance, in South Africa, you have the African National Congress, and part of its wing is the South African Communist Party. And you go into other countries, Ethiopia, for instance, has a Marxist party that is still there today. And you go to Eritrea and several other countries, those things are there. Some are one-party states, which in itself is not detrimental to development. Some have a parliamentary approach. It would depend. Now, obviously, others have problems with governance, and that is brought out of the colonial past. Nigeria would be an example. They have a lot of wealth, billions of dollars that have just, quote-unquote, disappeared. But that's not unusual when you start talking about those kinds of things. This particular is a mythical nation. Of course, Stan Lee dreamed it up in 1966 when many of the African nations had just received their quote-unquote independence. So it was a different time in a different place, and a lot of promise. And these states and economies themselves were ahead of a lot of the developing world. But then all of a sudden, because of racism, they started to lag behind in development because of the way development was set up. So their development was basically a situation that brought about the type of, in other words, in the emerging nations, Korea, for example, Korea was allowed to emerge as a basically proxy state for manufacturing. There, prior to that, it was Japan, where all the cheap goods were made, and then in Korea, and then, of course, it passed on to other emerging nations as the economies of the world became much more globalized. But now we are seeing a globalized country, a globalized economy in the world. And China, who has their preliminary session now, 3 days, is very prominent across the continent of Africa. For instance, in the recent coup in Zimbabwe, you had President Mugabe, who had been there since independence, replaced by a president, a so-called president, that was selected in Beijing, period. And the role of the Chinese in many developments, locomotives, other kinds of things, mining in Africa cannot be underestimated, period. So let us move on here. Halfway around the world, MIT educated a former Black Ops soldier. Oh, this is part of it. We won't go into so many of the characters in the movie, but there are a lot of characters in this movie. I've not seen this movie, I must confess. Well, let's move on here. This is from the New York Times. This is by Bachelor Dargis. Anyway, the Black Panther shakes up the Marvel universe. Joel, the movie Black Panther, creates wonder with great flair and feeling. You'll hear these sort of adjectives spoken throughout. Hollywood rarely dreams of anything. Myths, big studios, fantasies that take you out of your joy seat to hit the same exhausted story and a franchise expanding bets. Not this one. Its axis points to a futuristic nation. We've already talked about that in African Eden, where green landscapes meet blue sky scenes. Fictional. There is spaceships with undercarriages resembling tribal marks, soaring on over majestic waterfalls. And we won't go into the characters here, but to say that Stan Lee wrote the script and Jack Kirby did the original artwork. That is Chain Sensen in Pop's Ryan Coogler. And he's going to go on a variety of costume alterations and adventures in the comic series on the direction of the filmmaker Reginald Hurlin. And more recently, author Taishi Coates. To direct the first one, of course, they tapped Ryan Coogler. He co-wrote the movie also there. Taishi Coates wrote the recent comics. I mean, we touched upon that. We won't go into the characters in the film. But for a while, the story in the Black Panther veer here and there, jumping from Wakanda to Buzian, South Korea. Anyway, some sort of James Bond mixture going here. And this is, you have to entertain the audience, and this is one thing to remember always. Let's get a little bit to Taisha Coates. Now, this is written on the 31st of March in 2016. Helps the new Black Panther leave its print. This is in the New York Times by Robert Ito. The Black Panther may not be the mightiest superhero on the planet, but he is certainly among the coolest, created in 1966. The first African superhero in mainstream comics. Now, there were other African comics out there, comic books, I should say, series, written by African people. And we'll have to do an update to this and talk about some of those. I don't know if we'll have it ready for African History Month, but we'll have it ready. Most of the comics don't generate that much buzz, but again, most comics aren't written by Mr. Taisha Coates himself, a national correspondent of The Atlantic, which just upped its game with fresh money from a collective. The War Between the World and Me, the best-selling author Between the World and Me, which won a National Book Award last year, one of the most celebrated authors. He has a new one out 8 years, We Were in Power, but this is written before it came out. One of the most celebrated authors about race in America, writing about an African superhero who has plummeted the Captain America, members of the KKK. The collective response from friends of comics and Mr. Coots, I read that. So the book arrives at the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther, who's first appeared in Series 52 of the Fantastic Four, and yes, he beat them up too. Next month, the superhero will make his big screen debut in Marvel Comics' Captain America Civil War. That will be with Chadwick Boseman, and again, that has already been accomplished. Didn't see that one either. Coates and Markham and Marvel collaboration extended from a 2015 conference hosted by The Atlantic, where the author interviewed the editor of Marvel, Mr. Anon, I think is what his name is. Sanan Anan. Anyway, is entitled "What If Captain America Were Muslim or Female?" And soon after that, the editor Tom Varus asked Coates if there were any characters he might like to write for them. A lifelong friend, of course, of Spider-Man and X-Men. Coates sent some of his favorites. The Black Panther was not on his list. He acted. Oh well. Anyway, but when he learned that Marvel was looking to feature the character in his own book again, the last one ended in 2012, Coates was immediately intrigued when Stan Lee and, of course, Mr. Kirby first dreamed up the Black Panther for Marvel. He was at the top of his game, descendants from a long line of kings, etc., etc. That is the plot of the movie. Eventually they'll get to ordinary working people, although race is an issue in the comic. Race is always there. Mr. Coates said it won't be at the forefront early on. The book is probably much more concerned with gender, and that has happened. It was kind of interesting at one time. The talk of equality was centered around gender. Heard a newly elected Midwest politician talking about that, the whole equality as to gender situation, that upon his election last November, he would, or this year, last year, anyway, that he would concentrate on racial equality. Now, there's a difference between gender equality and racial equality, and this movie will no doubt hit at that as things mature, period. And let's see what we also have here. Illustrating the book is the lifetime comic artist Brian Steffries, who was offered a job in September. Someone really good was going to write the series he recalled, and Steffries, it blew my brains out. So Taisha Coates wrote in on I'm not sure if he had a black hat on or a white hat on. questions and notes on notes, probably communicated with him more than any other writer I've ever worked with. That's Mr. Fries there. And according to Jonathan Hickman, the most recent author of the Black Panther Adventures, I don't know where he came in here, but the thing that people should understand about Taishi is that he's a comic book superfan, and he knows his stuff. Well, that's good. The film director and producer, Reginald Hudlin, I guess, he did House Party and several others on Change, wrote a series of Black Panther comics starting in 2005, continuing even when he served as the BET Network president of entertainment. Didn't know that. He was absolutely looking forward to Mr. Coates' version. I love people. I love it when people like that go into comics. Okay, well, Taishi Coates is now in comics, and Marvel is in comics also. So this empire here is the multiple empire of 15th century Zimbabwe. Okay, well, all right. Well, have a little bit of history here if it has to be fictional history. So we thought we'd bring that in. And out of the Independent, the Black Panther brings Afrofuturism into the mainstream. And that has been around for a very long time. We thought is a major cultural event, and people are wearing African garb. I won't call them costumes, but African garb. Tuvis, a film that places superhero front and center of Marvel's cinematic universe. Its arrival on the screen coincides with UCLA, and we'll append this report, released report on diversity last year, top grossing films, and uncovering that people of color account for 13.6% of the film's leads, remaining unrepresented by a factor of 3 to 1. Yet the only part of this problem are Western-centric views of Africa that stereotypes and diminishes its countries and cultures still abound. The Panther, however, not only offers an Afrocentric perspective, but one that draws on the rich and layered concept of African futurism, born out of African artists imagining the endless possibilities of new futures. The movie follows Titular, the king of Wakanda, a fictional African country. A concept which falls in line with Afrofuturism themes. There is little consensus as to the concept's exact meaning or definition. It's one so variable and wide-ranging and often personal that it can be encompassed all at once. The feminist ideology, Black Panther represents this well, including all-female bodyguard unit there. The late Colonel Gaddafi, before he was assassinated, had female bodyguards. Mysticism, cosmology, mythology, and metaphysics. All rolled in one here. Some words you don't usually hear. Mr. Truger himself sees labels as ultimately constructing, especially since the increased open source nature of technology. And this is where we come in, has meant that more definitions are embraced. People make their own definitions. Well, technology is open sourced more today, but we see this as Ubuntu. On the open source report, one we do from WBRN, we'll be doing it this week, incidentally, is our technical report. We talk about open source software, open source hardware. People are working together for the collective good. Open source licensing, how it is done, and from open source software to liberate, in other words, free software, as the movement matures. And this is in line with the African concept of Ubuntu. And Nelson Mandela talks about Ubuntu, what it was, and how a villager, person would visit a village, and they would give him food and water on his journey. Not to say that people could not do for themselves, but the collective had a responsibility for the individual as the individual had a responsibility for the collective. So I think Afrofuturism is a kind of response to that. I find a way to build the cultural aspect of ancient African traditions with potential of the future. Just looking at Africans and African culture in the context is refreshing, when you are using it as in the content that mainstream media tends to portray it. Now, this is the view here. I think views of okay. Anyway, this is Mr. Brian Kugler speaking here. Let me just go back here. This is was in The Guardian. Kugler shares his definition of gender and philosophical outlook. This is on the 14th of February, 2018. Christine, looks like Longery here, wrote the article. Anyway, it's a very nicely done article. And let me move past this. The term was first coined in 1996 by the critic Mark DeRay in his essay Black to the Future, sorry about that, which examines the sci-fi works of African-American writers such as Sam Delaney and Mr. Atiba Butler, while also questioning why black voices are largely absent from a genre whose themes are so often built around the ideas of marginalization. Can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out, whose emerges have consequently been consumed by a search of legal traits of its history, imagine possible futures? DeRay writes, furthermore, is the unreal state of the future always owned by technocrats, futurologists, streamers, and set designers, white to a man, who engineer our collective fantasies. Now, that is a very important point to remember there, and it has to be tied to the history. He said, however, DeRay was the first to formally recognize Afrofuturism, seemed almost to have a fairly widespread, had been widely spread by the late 50s. There are several texts even considered to be predecessors to the genre. One of them early is by William Edward Beauregard Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois. He was known on a short story that he wrote called Prince Steel. Dates, and that was in 1908, about a black sociologist who invented a megascope, which can see through time and space. Meanwhile, it's believed to be the first sci-fi novel by an African American. This was George Schuyler. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right here. It's Schuyler. Anyway, the story follows an African doctor who invents a serum which removes all pigments from his body. I read that, making black individuals look white. There's also a book called Black Like Me. Mr. Griffith wrote it, where he injected a dark serum. He was a European. Anyway, one of the black futurist critical voices was Sun Ra, who often is credited with introducing the philosophy to music. He was born in Birmingham, Alabama. He experienced a life-changing hallucinatory vision when he was abducted from the Earth and brought to Saturn, where he said the future was unveiled to him. Composed avant-garde music, which tied together the full spectrum of jazz, while blending the aesthetics of Ethiopian mythology and science fiction. He claimed, at least his persona claimed, he was actually an emissary from Saturn on a mission to preach peace, which in itself is good. in his album Space is a Place. Also gives way to a film of the same name. It was in 1973, in which he co-wrote and starred in himself. The film sees Sun Ra as, after landing on a new planet, deciding to found an Afro-American colony, subsequently traveling through Oakland, California in an effort to spread the word of his plans. And Mr. Kleber is out of Oakland also. The same idea is reflected in the work of George Clinton and his Parliament Funkadelics collective, a forging electorate take on a funk that encompassed both sci-fi and titular? I'm not sure. Anyway, the mothership connection here was George Clinton. Remember old George? Anyway, nonetheless, Afro-futurist themes can also be seen in the music of many others here in Raji Moore. Oh, Raji Moore, yeah. Afro Bambaataa. We at least recognize some of these, which include the album Arch Android. There's also a touch of Afrofuturism to be found in Beyonce's Grammy performance last year and several other pieces of her Lemonade era iconographic, such as referred to the Yoruba goddess, including Umoja. Anyway, so various others here. Certainly the Black Panther comics have their own part to play in the development of Afrofuturism, and of course is a different kind of situation. And Mr. Taishi Coates also coming into view in the movie. So the takeaway here is that you have a movie which is in a pop culture, in the middle of pop culture, but relates to the diaspora and to the history of African people in the U.S. from Du Bois, going back to him in the early 1900s with his sci-fi story, to others. And in other words, what we're talking about here, as LBJ also talked about this, is a continuum that we continue to make progress on this line. Now, this is around the Marvel franchise, and eventually, I'm assuming, as Professor Reed was talking about, you will see African Americans and Africans in the diaspora do these types of movies. In other words, not only direct them, but produce them and distribute them. Africans have a collective of 1.3 billion people, is the third largest collective of quote-unquote people, if you look at ethnicity in the world, behind China and India, which have various ethnicities there. We don't need to get into all these ethnicities, but we're looking at groupings of people. And as the late Kwame Ture used to talk about, and this is something to not be misunderstood, when you look at Afrocentrism, or as one person put it in a sort of I'm not sure, old school, out of date sort of thing, African nationalism. As we started this out, we were talking about African nations that took the socialist path. Now, as President Xi said at the most recent Party Congress in China, the Chinese Communist Party, what he was talking about was socialism with a distinct Chinese flavor. The same thing with various countries across the continent. They had the flavor. So if you want to call it collectivism and cronyism or whatever you want to call it, it dates back and even predates the writings of, say, Karl Marx and the writings of Lenin and of Stalin. But that is not as important as the work and you start out with the work, and back to Kwame Ture, that we understand when we speak of colonialism, neocolonialism, exploitation by the capitalist world. We see all of these factors there. And it goes, as this movie has, to a collective. And the UCLA study on diversity, people of quote-unquote color. And of course, there they're talking about various major groups of people, Africans in America, Asians, Latinos, and throwing all these into the 13-something percentage. Now, obviously, there are markets in the Spanish language, markets are there. But the whole idea of bringing all of these people front and center, and that's eventually where you get. You start out with Afrofuturism, and you end up with a collective responsibility, and you then will eventually form a more diverse, an international film community. So that is where you will eventually end up starting this out. Now, again, with the New York Times here, why Black Panther is a defining moment for African America. Now, it's kind of interesting here, Carvel Wallace. Now, he uses the word black, and there's a lot of debate we have with people using the word black as opposed to the word African. But let me just, I didn't talk about this, the Great Lake Theater, cinema, the kind of old-time movie house with Caveras ceilings and ornate crown moldings. It's in Oakland, California. There are local film festivals, independent film festivals, etc. After Hurricane Katrina, the lobby served as a drop-off point there in Oakland. I have to fall back on Professor Reed and Company on that. But was a weeknight viewing of Fruitvale Station. That was a 1973 movie directed by the Oakland native Mr. Ryan Coogler. It was about a real-life shooting of Oscar Grant. He was 22 years old, killed in Oakland, California. Grant's killing landed less like a news story and more like the death of a friend or child. He had worked at a popular grocery, gone to school and summer camp with the children of acquaintances. His death, he was shot by a transit cop while handcuffed, unarmed, and face down early in the morning of New Year's 2009. Sparked intense grief, outrage, and it should have years before the Black Lives Matter movement took condition, but that was the fight in Oakland. The word Black Panther were on it. Having gotten out of my car to take a picture of the Great Lakes marquee, that was the opening February the 16th. Black Panther was already, by a wide margin, the most important thing happening at the Great Lakes. And he goes on to talk about the two Jewish writers there, Mr. Lee, etc. And the subject of a third feature film after Fruitvale and Creed. Fruitvale and Creed was in 2015. The full trailer racked up 89 million views in 24 hours. That was on January 10th after tickets were made available for pre-sale. The movie Fandango managing editor there, with Eric Davis, tweeted that the movie's first 24 hours advance ticket sales exceeded any other movie from the Marvel cinematic universe. No doubt about that. We've talked about that various times here, and the hashtag Black Panther so lit, and welcome to Wakanda. Some of the hashtags distributed around there. King Jaffe Jaffer. That was Coming to America. That was my man in that. Remember that coming out. It wasn't part of the franchise, but it was an outstanding movie. The Black Panther is the first major black superhero movie, far from in the mid-90s of Damon Wayman's vehicle, Blankman, and Robert Townsend. Remember Robert Townsend there, Meteor Man, played the superhero. Promise is there. Blade released, again, that was in 1998. Hancock in... that was Wesley Snipes, tax evader. Anyway, as Vampire Hunter, and Hancock depicted Will Smith as a anti-hero. Oh, well. What Hollywood sometimes does. Anyway, we move on here. And this is interesting, too. We now have social media can be used for different other... It talks about Mr. Klugler and the first Black Panther comic as a child in Oakland, a shop called Dr. Comics, and Mr. Games, a mile from the Grand Lake Cinema. When I sat down with him in early February at the Montage Hotel in Beverly Hills, so he's kind of moved on. Kugler played football in high school, a normal upbringing there. We just sort of jotting through here. Kugler made his first journey to the continent, visiting Kenya, South Africa, the kingdom of Lesotho, a tiny nation in the center of the South African land mass. And it was actually what was Lesotho was actually based on this mythical nation. Kugler told them that he needed to visit an old woman. This is where he went to visit the old woman to drop a watermelon off, of all things. And we are stopping so much, he asked. Melon, of course, was a sacred thing. And this from country to country. And she was, in fact, a watermelon farmer, but her crop had not yet ripened. Interesting. Anyway, as we go down, never mind, but most of us have never been to Africa, and this is using in a generic sense the African continent. And even talks in this one an envision of a free self. Nia Simone once described freedom as the absence of fear, as with all humans, the attempt of African Americans to picture a homeland, whether real or mythical, was an attempt to picture a place where there was no fear. That's very, very important there. At the time, Lieutenant Uhura, played by Michelle Nichols, was so vital for African Americans. Now, this is part of the history here where the original Star Trek, which was a peaceful international crew, still under the charge of a European from Iowa. And at the time, the character of Uhura there, an African woman of the future, as an accomplished paleontologist. Nichols told NPR the Reverend Dr. King himself persuaded her not to quit the show. After the first season, it was a symbol of great progress that she was conceived as something more than a maid. And this is true. This is where images are very, very important. This is one of the more important things under the presidency of Barack Obama for young African Americans and older African Americans, but particularly young African Americans, saw President Obama sitting there behind the desk in a suit and a very articulate person. So they started to mimic President Obama as a matter of pride of being African people, that an African grew up in Hawaii, that had a European mother, a multicultural family out in Hawaii, from a working class family, could ascend to be the President of the United States. And that changed the whole paradigm of history. And that prompted Taoiseach Coates to write 8 years when we were in charge. And I suppose somebody will pin something now for for DJ Trump. 4 years we were in the outhouse as part of it as it goes. But out of this, if you look at the Trump era, when obviously white supremacy is a paramount, developments like this come out of it. Developments coming out of the Me Too movement also coincide with this. And now the student movement, similar to one Dr. King had in Birmingham, Alabama. High schoolers and grade schoolers are walking out of classes over the country. Schools are talking about going on strike to ban assault weapons. And the result of just a few days of campaigning, after 17 people died meaninglessly in Florida, now they're saying that more than one quote-unquote copper didn't react as he should. There was about a 6-minute shooting spree there, according to witnesses. And evidently they never did apprehend the murderer until he literally had fled the school. Now, this in the aftermath of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, that people have now taken to the streets and continual pressure. I was on the T and heard some young man trying to speak in support of assault weapons, which he was a lunatic, but he also, symptoms, he was a member of alt-right, so a different situation. Sort of like DJ Trump going to speak at the CPAP, the Conservative Conference, and talking about the snake. Well, there are a lot of snakes in the desert. Having done some desert camping, we know about snakes. We know about armadillos, rattlesnakes in particular. But the rattlers do go, and then they get you. But behind that, the National Rifle Association, funded by people that make guns. Now, are we saying guns are bad? No, guns are not bad. The problem is the types of legislation. Now, a few things that could happen. One, the liability could be taken off of the gun manufacturers. That even got Bernie Sanders in trouble. But that was coming from Vermont. They were small gun manufacturers as opposed to large gun manufacturers. But that liability was taken off. The good students of Florida would be suing these gun manufacturers, and then you would get sensible gun laws. Now, the whole situation here is on the 24th. More than just a cinema, people will be in Washington, D.C. Students, high schoolers, grade schoolers, anyone get there. We were out marching the other day with some high school kids. Anyway, nonetheless, they would be there in great numbers and in cities and continue the campaign. United, Delta, various airlines have dropped them. The Chubb Group insurance companies have dropped preference they gave the NRA members. The NRA said this won't intimidate us. It may not intimidate the hardcore of their membership, but what it symbolizes through the media, again, this is sort of like a Black Panther movie in the sense that people now see the NRA's power diminishing. And once you get on that diminished roller coaster, you come down. And the people that they fund, I'm talking about the politicians, in many districts will get scared, because if you have a district, say for instance, there was a 10-point spread between Hillary Clinton and DJ Trump. Example would be in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, those very close states there, where 80,000 votes were the difference. You could be in trouble, because if you get knocked off because of your association with the NRA, that's one more House seat down. It's such as what's going on in Missouri with Gittens, the ex-Navy SEAL that was a family values man, etc., sponsored a lot of right-wing legislation, inopportunists on the scene. Before that, he was seen around the Democratic convention, because the Democrats are running a bunch of ex-military types that the peace campaigner Cindy Sheehan, that always speaks of her mind, said the Democrats are just running a bunch of, as she termed it, crackers. I didn't say that, she did. But nonetheless, it's Glittens falls in there. Now he's on indictment for taking pictures of a woman and violating a law in Missouri regarding privacy. So, in other words, there's a lot of political activity going on, and this movie's appearance is very good in that sense, that it brings national identity to people, which is a positive thing in the dialectic. We see things that are positive, things that are negative, such as the capital moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, with the Mideast situation, the additional sanctions against Democratic Republic of Korea, a republic of people of color. And all these sanctions are against primarily people of color, with the exception of the Russian Federation, but primarily Venezuela, etc. And these are the negative parts of it, but the positive parts of it are these movements like the Me Too movement, was started incidentally by an African-American lady that has, as they say, shaken the boots of many. We came in with the trailer from the movie, and we'll leave if I can get another trailer going here. All right, we're running pretty good here. If I can find another trailer to lead out of here with. This is from the New York Times. I'm not sure we'll get it up here or not. We'll see.
I'm Ryan Coogler, co-writer and director of Black Panther. This scene is an extension of an action set piece that happens inside of a casino in Busan, South Korea. Now T'Challa is in pursuit of Ulysses Claw, who's escaped the casino. He's enlisting the help of his younger sister, Shuri, here, who's back home in Wakanda. And she's remote driving this Lexus, a sports car now, and she's driving from Wakanda. She's actually in Wakanda, and T'Challa's in his Panther suit on top of the car in pursuit.
I don't see if the movie continues here. It perhaps may not, but you understand this movie is a global adventure. Having moved to South Korea, and you notice a Lexus.
These are two of T'Challa's comrades here. It's Nakia, who's a spy, driving, and Okoye, who's the leader of the Dora Milaje, in the passenger seat in pursuit of Claw. The whole idea for this scene is we wanted to have a car chase that was unlike any car chase that we had seen before, and combining the technology of Wakanda and juxtaposing that with the tradition of this African warrior culture. In our film, we kind of broke down characters between traditionalists and innovators. We always thought it would be fun to contrast these pairings of an innovator with a traditionalist. T'Challa, we kind of see in this film is a traditionalist when we first meet him. His younger sister, Shuri, who runs Wakanda's tech, is an innovator. So we paired them together. In the other car, we have Nakia and Okoye, which is also a traditionalist innovator pairing. Nakia is a spy who we learn is kind of unconventional. In Okoye, who's a staunch traditionalist, probably one of our most traditional characters in the film. She doesn't really like being in clothes that aren't Wakandan, and the scene is kind of about her really, bringing the Wakandan out. One of the images that almost haunted me was this image of this African woman with this red dress just blowing behind her, spear out. And so a big thing was like, for me, was getting the mount right so that the dress would flow the right way and wouldn't be impeded by the bracing system she was sitting on. So that took a lot of time. We had to play with the fabric and the amount of the dress, to get it right.
Very interesting. That was Mr. Krugler there. And we've already played the trailer. We came in with the trailer. This will do it for us, from WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network. Special programming for African History Week. We will continue with this special programming the next 3-4 days of this. We'll have our regular political program on Monday, the Monday Morning Quarterback. We've been doing it for a number of years now, where we look at the Sunday talk shows, and we quarterback them, our other events. And many times, some of the events of the day are themselves not on the Sunday talk shows, but they are pivotal events. So we do that. We'll be looking at spring training and our beloved baseball. And we have the NBA. We have college basketball going on. The Olympic Games wrapping up. We are debating here. We'll do a special program probably on BR on the World, or Boston Red on the World. We'll talk about Africans, various Africans from various nations at the Winter Olympics. And hopefully we can, as they say, get that out of the production hamper. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on a Monday morning. Incidentally, we also have an open source report where we shall talk about open source.